It was the year of 1967. The war in Vietnam was at its height, and thousands of young American soldiers were thousands of miles from home, facing an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain, every shadow of the forest, every secret of that merciless jungle. But the real challenge did not come only from enemy fighters. Nature itself was transformed into a silent and formidable adversary, an invisible predator that made no distinction between allies and adversaries. This is the story of the most feared elements of the Vietnamese jungle, told through the eyes of those who survived to recount their experiences. When the first American soldiers landed in Vietnam, many came from cities, farms, and quiet suburbs of the United States. Nothing could have prepared them for what they would find. The Vietnamese jungle was not just a battle scenario. It was a living, breathing organism that seemed to conspire against the foreign presence. From the moment they stepped on that moist, warm ground, the soldiers knew they had entered a completely different world, where the rules of conventional warfare simply did not apply. The first thing that attacked the senses was heat. Not an ordinary heat, but a suffocating oppression that turned every movement into a battle against physiology itself. Temperatures often exceeded 35 degrees Celsius, but what made that heat truly unbearable was the humidity. The air was so dense and saturated with water that breathing felt like trying to inhale through a damp cloth. The combat uniforms, designed for temperate climates, became extremely uncomfortable under the tropical sun in a matter of minutes. Each soldier was soaked in sweat, and that sweat never completely dried. The combination of heat and humidity created a perfect environment for a series of medical problems that would plague the troops throughout the campaign. Subscribe to the channel and comment on the time you are watching this documentary. Your participation is very important to us. The feet of the soldiers suffered in a particular way. A condition known as trench foot or immersion foot became epidemic among troops. Between the constant rain during the monsoon season, the flooded rice paddies, the streams and swamps they needed to cross, and the relentless sweat, the boots never dried. The skin of his feet was macerated, white and wrinkled, as if he had spent days submerged in the water. Open wounds developed, quickly infected the tropical environment, and already strenuous walks became extremely painful. Some soldiers developed infections so severe that they needed to be evacuated, but most simply learned to live with the constant discomfort, applying talc when possible and hoping that the wounds would not get worse. But the heat and humidity were just the beginning. The Vietnamese jungle was a green labyrinth of dense vegetation that blocked sunlight and created a perpetual dimness on the forest floor. Giant trees rose like columns of natural cathedrals, their canopies intertwining tens of meters above the ground. Beneath them, layered and layered vegetation formed an almost impenetrable barrier. Thick vines like human arms hung from the trees, creating natural curtains. Thorny bushes tore uniforms and scratched exposed skin. Giant bamboos grew in such dense formations that advancing through them required cutting each stalk individually with machetes. The simple act of walking 100 meters could take hours of hard and exhausting work. Visibility in the jungle was virtually nil. A soldier could rarely see beyond a few feet in front of him. This created a constant and devastating psychological strain. The enemy could be just a few steps away, completely invisible behind the green curtain. Ambush was the preferred tactic of Vietnamese forces, and the dense vegetation made these ambushes devastatingly effective. American soldiers marched in Indian rows through narrow tracks, knowing that at any moment, from any direction, an explosion of enemy fire could come. Every shadow moved, every sound was a potential threat. Paranoia was not a sign of mental weakness, it was a perfectly rational survival response. The jungle also played with human perception. Under the closed canopy of the forest, the light was strange, filtered and green, creating constant optical illusions. Shapes moved in the periphery of the vision, but when a soldier turned his head, there was nothing there. Sounds echoed in strange ways, making it impossible to determine their origin or distance. A shot fired 100 yards away could sound like it came from all directions at once. This constant sensory disorientation mentally depleted the soldiers as much as physical exertion depleted their bodies. And then there was the rains. During the monsoon season, which lasted for months, The rain did not fall. It plummeted as if entire oceans were being dumped from the sky. Couldn't stay dry. No matter how many layers of waterproof equipment a soldier used, water always found a way. She would run down her neck, infiltrate the seams of her clothes, fill her boots. The soil of the jungle turned into deep, treacherous mud that sucked the boots off the feet of men. Rivers that were once shallow streams became raging torrents impossible to cross. Slopes turned into dangerous mudslides. And with the rain came an amazing cold. Yes, cold in the tropics. When drenched to the bone, with the wind blowing through the forest, the soldiers trembled wildly, their bodies unable to maintain proper temperature. Hypothermia was a real threat, even in a tropical zone. The rain also brought another problem. It made it impossible to keep anything dry. Food, cigarettes, house mail, everything was soaked and moldy. Weapons needed constant maintenance so as not to rust and jam. Radios failed. Maps disintegrated. The very infrastructure of modern warfare struggled to function in that hostile environment. Soldiers quickly learned that superior American technology had its severe limitations in the Vietnamese jungle. But perhaps nothing caused more psychological discomfort than the creatures that inhabited that jungle. And we're not just talking about big animals, they were the small, ubiquitous, and often dangerous creatures that infiltrated nightmares. The leeches were a constant and disgusting presence. These parasitic worms hung on the damp vegetation, waiting. When a soldier passed by, they would attach themselves to exposed skin or find paths through clothing. Too small to be felt initially, they secreted anticoagulants and fed on the blood of their victims. Soldiers often only discovered that they were infested with leeches when they stopped to rest and saw bloodstains scattered on their clothes. Removing the leeches was an unpleasant but necessary process, usually involving burning them with the tip of lit cigarettes or applying insect repellent directly on them. The wounds they left bled profusely and often became infected. Mosquitoes were another constant pest. Clouds filled the air at dusk and dawn, attacking any exposed skin. His incessant buzzing was maddening, and his bites left itchy bumps that easily infected themselves when scratched. But far worse than the nuisance were the diseases they carried. Malaria was endemic in the region, and despite prophylactic regimes of quinine pills, thousands of soldiers contracted the disease. Malaria not only crippled soldiers with high fevers, violent chills, and delusions, but it could also return repeatedly, haunting survivors for years after leaving Vietnam. Dengue was another mosquito-borne disease that ravaged troops, causing muscle pain so intense that the disease was called bone-breaking fever. The ants of the Vietnamese jungle were aggressive and numerous. Some species had extremely painful bites, injecting venom that caused swelling and throbbing pain. Others moved in columns of millions, consuming everything in their path. Soldiers who were unlucky enough to disturb a nest or stand in the way of one of these migratory columns soon found themselves covered by thousands of biting ants. The only solution was to undress quickly and shake clothes vigorously, a dangerous vulnerability in a combat zone. The giant centipedes of the jungle could grow up to 30 centimeters in length. Night creatures, they often found their way into the boots, backpacks, or sleeping bags of soldiers. Their bites were extremely painful, injecting a poison that caused severe swelling, nausea, and intense pain that could last for days. Some soldiers developed severe allergic reactions that required medical evacuation. But of all the creatures in the jungle, snakes were the most feared. Vietnam was home to some of the most venomous snakes in the world, and the dense jungle made frequent encounters. The green bamboo viper lived in the trees and low vegetation, its bright green coloration camouflaging it perfectly between the leaves. Aggressive when disturbed, her bite injected a dangerous hemotoxic poison that required urgent medical treatment. Soldiers learned to carefully examine each branch before grabbing it, each bush before passing through it. But in the urgency of combat or in the darkness of night, such precautions were not always possible. The kite snake, with its distinctive black and white bands, was even more dangerous. Nocturnal and usually lethargic during the day, she became active and a hunter after dark. Its neurotoxic venom attacked the nervous system, causing progressive paralysis and difficulty breathing. The particular challenge of the kite was that its bite was relatively painless. A soldier could be bitten at night while sleeping and not notice until symptoms of poisoning began hours later, when it was often difficult for effective treatment. The royal snake, the largest venomous snake in the world, also inhabited the forests of Vietnam. Although encounters were rare, when they occurred they were extremely dangerous. These snakes could grow up to 5 feet long and were surprisingly aggressive, especially during the nesting season. A real snake could lift a third of its body off the ground, stand at the height of a man's chest, and attack with astonishing speed. Its venom was extremely potent and posed a serious threat to life. Soldiers developed all sorts of superstitions and precautions against snakes. Examining boots before putting them on was a sacred ritual. Shaking clothes vigorously before wearing them was mandatory. Poking backpacks and equipment with a stick before touching them became second nature. Even so, snake bites were common enough for each unit to carry multiple antivenom kits, although the effectiveness of these was limited at best, especially if there was a delay in administration. The larger fauna of the jungle also presented dangers. Tigers still roamed the remote forests of Vietnam at 967, though encounters were rare. There were occasional reports of nocturnal incidents involving large predators. Whether these reports were entirely accurate or partially military legends was debatable, but they certainly contributed to the fear that permeated the nights in the jungle. Wild boars were a more common and verifiable threat. Big, aggressive when cornered or surprised, these animals could weigh more than 100 pounds and had sharp fangs capable of causing serious injury. A patrol that inadvertently placed itself between a sow and its young could face a dangerous situation, especially in dense vegetation where maneuvering was difficult. But it was not only the living animals that presented dangers. Certain plants had caustic sap that caused severe chemical irritations to the skin. Thorns from some species of palm trees caused wounds that swelled considerably and became easily infected. Poisonous mushrooms grew prolifically in the humid environment, and soldiers trying to supplement their rations needed to be very careful in identifying which fungi were safe for consumption. Water itself, essential for survival, was dangerous. The streams and rivers of the jungle seemed inviting, especially for soldiers burning with heat and thirst, but they were contaminated with all sorts of pathogens. Drinking untreated water was almost a guarantee of dysentery, a debilitating condition that left soldiers weak, dehydrated, and miserable. Intestinal parasites were common, causing chronic health problems that persisted long after the end of military service. Soldiers carried iodine tablets to purify water, but these made the water taste horrible and were not always 100% effective against all pathogens. The rice paddies, an iconic part of the Vietnamese landscape, presented their own particular challenges. Still, warm water was an environment conducive to disease. But water buffaloes working in the fields also posed risks. These large, temperamental animals could be extremely aggressive, especially males during the mating season. There were documented cases of buffalo attacking soldiers, posing considerable danger. In addition, local farmers sometimes used buffalo as a primitive alarm system. The animals recognized the local Vietnamese, but were agitated in the presence of foreigners, potentially warning enemy combatants about the approach of American troops. Physical deterioration was a constant battle. Cuts and scratches were inevitable in the jungle, and virtually every wound became infected. The warm, humid environment was perfect for bacterial growth. Skin infections were universal among soldiers in the field. Boils, abscesses, and fungal eruptions covered the bodies of men. Ringworm thrived on constantly moist skin. The groin, armpits, and feet were particularly affected, developing painful, itchy rashes that were impossible to heal properly in field conditions. Some soldiers developed infections so severe that the resulting fevers incapacitated them as much as battle wounds. Carrying 60 or more pounds of equipment through rough terrain in extreme heat with inadequate sleep took a terrible physical toll. The soldiers lost weight dramatically, their bodies consuming muscle mass when field rations did not provide enough calories to compensate for extreme energy expenditure. They developed a cadaveric thinness, with deep eyes and hollowed faces that made 20-year-old men appear to be 40. The exhaustion was not only physical but mental and emotional as well. The constant tension of being in enemy territory, the lack of quality sleep, the stress of combat, all accumulated into a kind of deep psychological fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to heal completely. The darkness under the forest canopy was absolute, a blackness so complete that a soldier could not see his own hand within inches of his face. Moving in darkness was impossible without light, but using a flashlight was to risk drawing enemy attention. Then the soldiers stood motionless by night, each sense alert and tense. Every sound was magnified in the darkness. The snap of a branch could be an animal or an approaching enemy combatant. The rustling of leaves could be wind or human movement. The imagination was sharpened, turning every innocent stimulus into a potential threat. Sentinels struggled with sleep, knowing that a moment of inattention could cost not only their lives but those of everyone in their unit. Night defensive positions were established with safety perimeters, but in the dense jungle terrain, these perimeters were small and vulnerable. Soldiers dug shallow trenches or positioned themselves behind fallen logs, always aware that dense vegetation meant the enemy could approach within a few meters before being detected. Hand grenades were kept close, security lock already loose for quick response. Weapons were held with fingers on the trigger. And yet, nighttime attacks often came as sudden surprises, brief bursts of confrontation that ended as quickly as they began, leaving casualties behind. The disorientation in the jungle was deep and constant. With no recognizable landmarks, no visible sky for celestial navigation, lost under a green canopy that looked the same in all directions, the soldiers depended completely on compasses and maps. But navigating the jungle was notoriously difficult. Military maps were often outdated or inaccurate. Characteristics of the terrain changed. What a map showed as a trail could be completely covered with vegetation growth. A creek marked on the map could have been dry or changed course. Units often found themselves out of position, sometimes dangerously lost, sometimes inadvertently marching in circles. Helicopter landing zones were difficult to locate from the air, leading to critical delays in medical evacuations or refueling. And there was the psychological reality of knowing that the enemy knew this terrain intimately. Vietnamese fighters had grown up in these forests, hunted in them, lived in them. They moved through dense vegetation with a facility that seemed supernatural to Americans. They could identify sounds, interpret signals, use terrain in ways that American soldiers could never fully learn in a single one-year service tour. The jungle was their home, and the Americans were clumsy, noisy intruders. The complex underground tunnels were another challenging manifestation of how the enemy used the environment. Elaborate networks of tunnels had been dug through the region, some existing for decades. These tunnels allowed enemy fighters to appear seemingly out of nowhere, attack, and disappear again without a trace. Tunnel entrances were camouflaged masterfully, covered in vegetation or disguised as natural features. American soldiers could walk directly over entire tunnel complexes without knowing of their existence. When tunnels were discovered, especially small soldiers, known as tunnel rats, volunteered to enter and explore. This was perhaps one of the most challenging tasks of the war. Crawling through narrow, dark passages, not knowing what lay ahead, whether there were traps, enemy combatants waiting, or whether the tunnel could collapse at any moment, required a particular kind of courage. Many tunnels had traps, including pits covered with sharp bamboo stakes, dangerous creatures placed in chambers as natural defenses, or improvised explosive devices. Traps were a constant threat throughout the jungle, not just in the tunnels. Trenches camouflaged with pointed stakes awaited unsuspecting soldiers. The cuttings were often treated with contaminated substances to increase the risk of infection even in superficial wounds. Spring traps made of flexible bamboo could fire through trails. Suspended grenades with firing wires were hung from trees. Improvised explosive devices were buried in tracks and fields. Each step in contested territory carried significant risks. The psychological stress of living under this constant threat was immense. Soldiers developed a variety of responses. Some became hypervigilant to the point of paranoia, unable to trust anything, seeing threats everywhere. Others developed a resigned fatalism, believing that survival or death were simply a matter of luck and that worrying was useless. Sleep disturbances were universal. Nightmares disturbed the little rest that the soldiers could get. The sound of helicopters, the smell of certain plants, the feeling of humidity, all could trigger stress responses even years after leaving Vietnam. The emotional loneliness was deep. Even surrounded by unit mates, each soldier faced his personal terrors. Letters from home could take weeks to arrive and provided a tenuous connection to a world that seemed increasingly unreal and distant. Soldiers formed intense bonds with their unit mates, a camaraderie forged in shared adversity that was deeper than normal friendship. Seeing companions injured or not returning left deep emotional wounds that never fully healed. There was also a growing disconnect between the soldiers in the camp and what they perceived as a lack of understanding at home. News of anti-war protests was demoralizing. Feeling that their sacrifice and suffering were not only unappreciated but actively criticized created bitterness and alienation. Many soldiers stopped trying to explain their experiences in letters home, realizing that people who had not been there simply could not understand the reality of what they faced. The jungle also defied conventional concepts of the battlefront and safe territory. There were no clear front lines. War was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. An area that was peaceful one day could become an intense combat zone the next day. Seemingly safe bases could be attacked by mortars or infiltrators. No place was truly safe. This fluid nature of guerrilla warfare meant that stress and danger were constant, without the psychological relief of knowing that there was a safe rear to retreat to. The cumulative effects of all these factors were profound. Soldiers who had arrived in Vietnam as young idealists often left the country as profoundly changed men, carrying physical and psychological traumas that would last for decades. The Vietnamese jungle became part of their deepest memories, a haunting presence that would never leave them completely. Many years later, veterans still woke up sweating, having dreamed that they were back in that sweltering green vegetation, hearing whispers in the darkness, feeling the oppressive pressure of the invisible threat. The combat experience in the Vietnamese jungle revealed both the incredible resilience and the fundamental vulnerability of the human spirit. Soldiers endured conditions that seemed beyond the human ability to endure, but the cost of that resistance was high. Nature had proved as formidable as any human army, and perhaps more ruthless. Unlike a human enemy, the jungle did not negotiate, did not make truces, showed no mercy. She simply was, and those who entered her domain had to adapt or perish. The lessons learned in the Vietnamese jungle would influence military thinking for decades to come. The importance of environment-specific training, the need for suitable equipment for tropical climates, the understanding of guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency, all this was bought with the blood and suffering of a generation of soldiers. Military doctrine was rewritten, strategies were reassessed, and new approaches were developed, all based on the hard lessons learned in those merciless jungles. But beyond the tactical and strategic lessons, there was a deeper human legacy. Vietnam veterans carried with them not just memories of battles, but visceral memories of sweltering heat, never-ending moisture, leeches feeding unseen, deadly serpents waiting in every shadow, an environment that seemed to actively conspire against their survival. These memories shaped not only their own lives, but influenced entire families, communities, and eventually national consciousness about the true cost of war. Today, decades later, the Vietnamese jungle still remains, indifferent to the human battles that took place under its canopy. Nature took its course, war scars were gradually covered by new growth, and the forest returned to seem as primordial and untouched as it always seemed. But for those who fought there, every element of that jungle is permanently etched in memory. The smell of decaying vegetation, the sound of heavy rain on leaves, the feeling of humid tropical heat, all this can instantly transport a veteran back in time, to those days in 967,000, when they were young facing ancient and modern terrors simultaneously. The story of these soldiers and their battle against the elements of the Vietnamese jungle is a testament to both the human ability to endure adversity and the power of nature to challenge and humiliate even the most advanced military technology. It is a reminder that no matter how sophisticated our weapons or strategies become, the fundamental nature of the environment can still be the deciding factor in conflict. And it is a memorial to the thousands who faced these conditions and survived to tell their stories, as well as to those who did not return, left forever in the green jungles of Vietnam. May their experiences not be forgotten. May their sacrifices be remembered. And may we learn from their trials, so that future generations may avoid repeating the same mistakes. And may the Lord God bless and protect all those who have served, giving them peace and healing from the traumas they carry, and eternal comfort to those who made the supreme sacrifice in that faraway land.